Good afternoon, and welcome to the third day of the third Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference that the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, QTRIC, is very proudly hosting digitally for you here. My name is Parvati Pillai, and I work as the Program Manager for ZEP Consulting Services and Business Development at QTRIC. Success is always the output of a process that involves a great team, consistent and very planned hard work, and excellence at its core. However, it is always a process that is catalyzed by unwavering leadership. And that leadership doesn't stop with attaining success alone. The leaders, the true leaders, would be striving to move beyond the success that they attained and enhance it, better it continuously. Today, we are going to be hearing about how we need to build back better. What does better mean? From Ms. Jennifer McNeill, Vice President, Public Sector Sales and Marketing at New Flyer Industries. I do want to welcome Jennifer to the stage to actually deliver the keynote presentation. The floor is yours, Jennifer.
Thank you, Parvati. So good afternoon. My name is Jennifer McNeill, and I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for New Flyer and MCI's public sector business. I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Petrunich and the QTRIC team for hosting this incredible conference. Your leadership in the low carbon mobility space continues to advance the technology and propel state-of-the-art forward. Next slide. The past year has presented some incredible challenges. As an industry dedicated to serving the public during a global public health crisis, we have been relentlessly focused on overcoming obstacle after obstacle, day after day. We've watched both individuals and organizations make heroic contributions to keeping us safe and getting us through the pandemic. With the vaccine rollout, we're starting to feel hopeful about remobilization and recovery and looking forward to a brighter future. But if you're anything like me, however, you can see a light at the end of the tunnel and are not 100% sure that it's not an oncoming train. Lately, we've been reading headlines on unprecedented levels of funding and support committed to public transit, to zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure, and to workforce development, all with the promise of building back better. But the billion or possibly trillion-dollar question is, what is better? To me, better means addressing both the causes and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and learning lessons from this really unique moment in history. Next slide, please. Perhaps it's a function of being stuck in my house for 15 months, or maybe because science and engineering makes me happy. But I've had the opportunity to do a little reading lately. And scientists have clearly drawn the linkage between new pathogens that cross over between animals and humans, like COVID-19 or SARS, to climate change and the loss of biodiversity and buffering species. This evidence supports the One Health concept, this idea that human health, animal health, and our planet's health are inextricably linked. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has shown that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius depends on reducing greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade, where reduced levels in 2030 leads to a higher probability of success, meaning we can't simply wait and implement a bunch of actions right before the deadline to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Nature just doesn't work that way. So unless we take bold and decisive action today to get to net zero emissions, we will likely continue to face outcomes like global pandemics and natural disasters. Next slide, please. The good news is there have been enhanced goals announced over the last 100 days. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced the enhanced emission reduction goal of 40 to 45% by 2030. The US rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, and President Biden announced that the US will target reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that the UK will cut carbon emissions by 78% by 2035. Bringing forward the current target for reducing carbon emissions by 15 years. And so while there are debates in both the scientific and political communities as to whether or not these emission reduction levels are enough, I think we can all agree that these commitments represent a very significant do different for our world. Next slide, please. For us, the major do different to mitigate climate change is zero-emission public transit, and we're thrilled to see the funding commitments that have been announced this year. In Canada, we saw our country take initiative towards a zero-emission future, with an ambitious goal of 5,000 zero-emission buses on the road by 2025. It was accompanied by the first commitment to infrastructure of its kind, a $33.6 billion investment in the Canada Infrastructure Program, which included funding streams for public transit with a climate lens and green infrastructure. And earlier this month, US Congress released its 5-year, $547 billion Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, also known as the INVEST Act, which is specifically focused on creating good-paying jobs to rebuild and reimagine America's surface transportation infrastructure. With $109 billion marked for transit investment, the INVEST Act proposes record investments to increase accessible and equitable transit, scale up zero-emission deployment, and deliver workforce development. The UK government has launched their national bus strategy, and it sets out how they will accelerate the transition to greener and more sustainable transport, including delivering 4,000 new British-built electric or hydrogen buses across England and safeguarding the UK bus manufacturing industry. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about the economic impact of the pandemic in forums such as these ones, most of the time we focus on the impacts of plummeting ridership and the need for relief funding for transit. But here, I think the concept of building back better forces us to look through a much broader lens, understanding the economic impact on global output and the financial strain on businesses and individuals in order to create a more resilient economy for our country going forward, and one that's able to withstand crises. The International Monetary Fund has projected that the cumulative loss in global output relative to the path projected pre-pandemic will be $11 trillion by the end of this year. And depending on the path to recovery, it could grow to $28 trillion by 2025. Canada is actually one of the more fortunate countries. We expect to reach pre-pandemic output levels later this year and expect recovery to our original GDP trajectory late 2022, according to the OECD. Our economy's relative resilience has been attributed to a few things: government support for businesses and households, vaccination rates, significant fiscal stimulus, commodity exports, and the prospects of increased demand arising from the US fiscal package. Next slide, please. However, although the COVID-19 pandemic affected everyone, the economic crisis has been extremely inequitable. Here in Canada, the combination in food services, manufacturing, and retail trade are the top 3 business categories that have been receiving the most support from the Canadian government in order to keep workers employed through the pandemic. Workers in these areas have been impacted dramatically with layoffs, forced use of vacation, and wage and shift reductions. In addition, remote learning and reduced childcare capacity have forced many parents who cannot work from home into some very tough choices. So when you dig a little deeper, you can see both the gender, race, and age bias for unemployment. Women, visible minorities, and youth have been disproportionately experiencing financial strain, often in lower paying jobs to start with. Conversely, those in higher income brackets who do have the ability to work from home haven't enjoyed the discretionary spending they normally do, travel, entertainment, retail. These folks have either been spending money on their homes or are sitting on a bunch of discretionary income that should get invested into the economy as we reopen. It's a really inequitable situation, which will lead to an inequitable recovery unless we're really thoughtful about how we approach it. And we need to learn from this lesson. Next slide, please. Investment in zero emissions public transit on both sides of the border will lead to good jobs in manufacturing and the clean energy sector. We are so fortunate that Canada has such a vibrant presence in both industries. Today's issue is really one of urgency. From an economic perspective, we cannot afford to take years between the announcement of these investments to the resulting demand for labor. Employment recovery depends on it happening faster. And as the jobs come back, it's important to remove barriers that make the industry inaccessible to those most impacted by the pandemic: women, youth, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And while I'm not certain that every job or every industry can be made pandemic-proof, I do believe that making our organizations diverse, equitable, and inclusive can mean that the hard times and the tough choices have nothing to do with your race, age, or gender. It's a really complicated challenge to solve, but if we're truly to build back better, equity must be central to our solutions. Next slide, please. Transition to zero-emission transportation and clean energy presents a need for a skilled technical workforce: technicians, tradespeople, engineers. And these skills are scarce in the current labor market. In 2020, new registrations and certifications for skilled trades decreased by 43% and 49% respectively, following a year of decline in 2019. We actually run the risk that we will create good jobs, but won't be able to recruit into them. Stats Canada also reported that as of January 2021, young Canadians represented 44% of the net employment losses through the pandemic. And so workforce development, education, and encouragement for youth, women, and marginalized population to pursue skilled trades and jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math has to be part of the solution as well. It's also imperative that private industry step up and participate in this activity. At NFI, we have developed workforce development as the fourth pillar in our technology roadmap. This year, we're launching our electrical technician apprenticeship program to support the transition. We hope to collaborate with local colleges and communities to have this program supported and accredited. It will also be necessary for employers to think differently about how we work. The ability to balance homeschooling and caregiving duties with remote work through the pandemic has been absolutely critical for many of our team members. We've learned quite a bit about productivity and communication over the past 15 months. And we're hoping to bring these lessons forward to create an inclusive, accommodating, and productive environment for everyone on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. You know, one of the most impressive outcomes of the pandemic is the rapid innovation of vaccines. According to Johns Hopkins University, the typical development time for a vaccine is 10 years. The scientists and manufacturers who cooperated, responded, and developed the COVID-19 vaccines in 10 months are truly superheroes, in my opinion. Last week, the CEO of Pfizer announced that they're working on processes that would enable the development of vaccines in 100 days. That'd be absolutely incredible. This ability to pivot and rapidly harness science and innovation in a crisis is most certainly a superpower. One of the reasons vaccine development was accomplished so quickly was the significant amount of data available and analysis to inform development. I think we can learn from this moment in history and apply this approach to the climate crisis. Rapid innovation in zero-emission transportation and clean energy requires that we also use analysis, prioritize the trials, testing, and experimentation based on risks and outcomes, and that we realize that a linear process of prototyping, pilot projects, and gradual transition into each city simply isn't going to be fast enough to achieve our climate targets. We need modeling and big data. We need to spend our time developing standards and test protocols rather than custom sequential experimentation. Next slide, please. At NFI, we're enabling innovation through investments and plans in our four-pillar approach, which includes buses and coaches, obviously. This year, we launched the latest battery electric versions of our entire transit portfolio. We have grown our infrastructure solutions business by more than 700%, enabling EV adoption. We've developed technology and telematics to collect the data that we need to innovate. And we've invested in workforce development to foster the talent we need to move the technology forward and manufacture at scale. Next slide, please. In March of this year, the UN Secretary General urged all countries, companies, and financial institutions to commit to net zero or carbon neutrality with clear and credible plans to achieve the target starting immediately. Our country leaders have made their commitments. Many cities have made their commitments and developed their transition plans. We need urgent action to cascade these commitments everywhere. Companies also need to develop clear and credible plans. At NFI Group, our annual environmental and social governance reporting has made electrification, responsible manufacturing and sourcing, and diversity, inclusion, and equity actions all central to our plans. Over the past 3 years, the S&P 500 ESG Index, which is designed to measure the performance of securities meeting sustainability criteria, actually outperformed the S&P 500 by almost 9%. There's a tremendous positive impact to our clean economy. It provides good jobs to Canadians, it supports the tax base, and it provides positive returns to shareholders. And so we need to make investing in the Canadian clean economy attractive at all levels. Next slide, please. And so what is better as we look to build back better? Well, better is doing our part to mitigate climate change through rapid transition to clean energy and zero-emission transportation at scale. Better is developing a diverse and resilient workforce where the consequences of crises such as pandemics and natural disasters are not disproportionately felt by marginalized communities, women, and youth. And better is investing in the rapid innovation to a clean economy. In closing, we have a precious and valuable opportunity on our hands to build back better. We have never before in Canada's history seen climate commitments or dollars flow to transit like this. And time is not on our side. So at the end of the day, better is acting urgently to build thriving, resilient communities and economies. Let's all do our part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was an amazing presentation. I particularly applaud you for painting the full picture. It's not like a technology focused presentation that you gave. You started off talking about equity, the global health, the employment recovery, the innovation acceleration, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things combined. And I think that is the need of the hour. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm sure our audience are having a lot of questions to ask you, but if I may start with one question that I do want to ask your insight on. When we think about transit agencies, and in your final call to action itself, you made that point clear. We have like a good time to act right now, but time is not on our end, right? On our side, we have the opportunity. There are still like transit agencies who know they need to go the electrified pathway. They need to move into electrification. Still, they are a little bit apprehensive because they do not know where to start. And you did, talk about investing in plans as well in your presentation. So how do you bring all these things together as a guidance to transit agencies who are on that apprehensive end of moving or taking advantage of the opportunity?
Well, I'm going to do a bit of a shameless plug for Q-Trick here. I think that, a lot of the work that has been done by the Q-Trick team and all of the participants over the last few years to do the modeling, collect the data, and validate with some real life examples, sharing that knowledge and insight, I hope gives comfort to agencies that are just starting out that the modeling works. It actually provides comfort and credibility to the analysis portion of it. The other thing that I think is the right place to start is actually assessing your infrastructure. And because that tends to be the pacing item. Really, you can buy as many electric buses as you like, but if you cannot fuel them, they're useless to you. So I think coming up with that plan for either charging or hydrogen fuel at scale is a really important thing to do for transit agencies right at the beginning.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
It does answer the question. I do have like a sub question from what you mentioned though, because we had like sessions yesterday as well, wherein, our New Flyer colleagues were talking about the same aspect of supporting transit agencies. So I do want to pose this question to you. When an agency goes into electrification as a community committed manufacturer, what are the ways in which you would be able to support them? Of course, you are providing the buses, but beyond that, like you do offer a lot of on-site support. And I do want to take it a step back as well about the point that you mentioned about the lack of the trained staff or trained professionals. When the time comes, we may not have enough people to recruit. So but there is still that gap wherein that advanced or sophisticated troubleshooting can happen or can be optimized at the hands of the manufacturer themselves and not necessarily a trained staff member. So where do you see that contribution from the manufacturer come into play?
Sure. So with every zero emission bus order that we have, we do support it with the training and on-site support with our customers. We've actually invested in our field service team to the extent that every city operating a zero emission vehicle of New Flyers has representation on the ground, monitoring and making sure that the buses achieve rollout every day. We also monitor the charging infrastructure every day. We do this through telematics. And our goal here is to make sure that we're actually working towards 100% availability of the system of buses and chargers over time. We recognize that, that agencies don't have experience and they require the training on both the buses and the chargers. And so we start out by offering information sessions free of charge through our Vehicle Innovation Center, even before the procurement, to inform the industry of the technology, key considerations. We want to make sure that when agencies go out to buy, that they are buying in an informed manner. And then once we are in the actual contract, we do offer training to our customers, both virtually and in person, which goes through everything from kind of basic overview training to high voltage safety, to troubleshooting and diagnostics. We put people on the ground. Our hope is that over time, we'll be able to kind of hand the keys back to the agency, but we recognize that it is going to take time to get from today to the point at which agencies are completely self-sufficient and comfortable with the technology.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. So in terms of that self-sufficiency piece as well, I do have like a question. When agencies are in the initial phases of the rollout, like no agency is going to go into a system-wide overhaul, replacing their current diesel fleet in its entirety, right? They would have, for a period of time, have to maintain a mixed fleet. So what is your recommendation in terms of enabling like a very smooth rollout plan for transit agencies? What is the level of investment that they ideally would need to make if such a recommendation is possible?
Well, I'm sure my transit agency colleagues and customers are probably better informed to answer that. But I think where I have observed the most success, agencies have created swing space, if you will, meaning they've actually electrified a garage or a particular space or route or depot that can be supported, so that they can actually bring that up, get a portion of their system electrified while they wind down the conventional side of it. And that requires quite a bit of planning and thought, and every city is different because every city has different access to the grid, has different setups for their garages and depots. And so, you really have to get in there as a partner to the project and listen and observe and go see, and then provide, recommendations in a very collaborative method. We do believe that it's a bit of a partnership.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I do have a technical question as well from one of our audience members. When it comes to the disposal or refurbishment of zero emission buses, how would you say it differs from the internal combustion engine buses at the end of their life cycle?
The disposal, like at the 20-year point or the 12-year? 12 to
Yeah.
20 year point?
I think the asker is asking about two things. One, it's a midlife refurbishment that needs to happen for the zero emission buses, and second thing, at the end of the life cycle, whatever it is, some agencies want to be like retained up until 18-year or 20-year period. What do they do with it? Essentially,
Right,
is the question.
right. Well, I believe, every transit vehicle, zero emission or otherwise, requires a refurbishment at some point in time. Aside from the drivetrain itself, you've got things like passenger amenities and seating. All this stuff changes over the course of 12 to 20 years. So I think, a midlife refurbishment is necessary no matter what. With our vehicles, we don't anticipate needing to replace all the batteries at a midlife, for example, but we do believe there will be some level of work scope that would be involved there. In terms of looking at the end of life considerations, a 20-year transit vehicle really is not something that you necessarily want to reuse. It's had its day at 20 years. However, there are recyclable components. And so one of the things that we've been actively working on is a plan for recycling of the battery packs at the end of life. We think that there's actually a really great value proposition for recycling, well, battery packs at the end of life, or if there happen to be cells that need to replaced or strings, throughout the life of the vehicle. There is a really good recycling story there.
Great. So I do want to ask you like another question from like a manufacturer's perspective here. If I'm a transit agency, one of the things that I am often wondering is, when should I make the purchase? Like there are, strategic reasons why I want to go zero emission, but if you are as a manufacturer releasing new versions of buses every year, it's more like the cell phone industry, right? I do want to get to the new one, but it's a capitally intensive exercise to engage in. So would I be out of the race if I were to procure and deploy a zero emission bus that you are offering currently for the next, that I want to maintain and use for the next 18 years?
I cringe every time I hear the word future proof with respect to zero emission vehicles. And the reason being is that you're absolutely right, Pavarthi. Like the technology is changing at the same sort of pace as smartphones. And so I don't think that there's a scenario where you can buy something that will be state of the art for 18 years in this space. I do, however, believe that what you buy will be relevant and supported and upgradable as we go forward. So, when I look at things like battery technology, that is changing every 12 to 18 months. And I think you can expect to see continued improvement in that space for the next 20 years. So, getting back to the theme of the speech, better is always better. Buying a zero emission vehicle today is better than operating your 20-year-old diesel. Just from an emissions perspective, it's dramatically better. So, I mean, I wouldn't hang on and wait for the technology to finish developing, because it's going to develop for the next 20 years.
Of course, it's an evolution, right? You never have an end point to it. I do want to turn to the pandemic effect, like how the pandemic has affected the assembly and production in Winnipeg and the US facilities for New Flyer and MCI. Are the return to work for New Flyer industry staff overall, how has it been? And there is another particular question about the predicted disruption to production if vaccinations are not 100% successful over the next year. So how do you comment on that?
So when the pandemic first started, we actually idled our facilities for anywhere between 6 to 11 weeks at that point in time, last April, May timeframe. And during that time, with NFI Group that had, more than 9,000 employees at that time, over 8,000 employees worldwide were furloughed for that period of time. And that's a little bit the economic hardship that I'm talking about. But we did bring all of our facilities back online, in end of May through June timeframe of last year. The thing that has been, and at that point in time, we actually developed some pretty stringent social distancing, masking, and sanitation protocols in our factories. We also took many of the employees who were able to work from home and moved them home. So my team, for example, moved home late March, and we haven't been back in the office yet. And the idea there was, if you don't have to be in the office, why would you be at this moment in time? Like, why would you put your neighbors in any sort of risk either? So that's where we have been. We brought the production teams back on site, and we have had varying levels of production over the last year. I will say, though, that the delay in capital procurement, so there have been a number of them over the last 12 months that were supposed to be released but weren't. That is producing a bit of a choppy production schedule. No doubt about it. The pandemic has definitely impacted that. So we're seeing fluctuations in the run rates for our facilities. The thing that has actually been, I would say, the most impactful lately are the challenges that the global supply chain have had. So whether it be product stuck in ports, or the global chip shortage, or you name it, if you've read it on the news, we've experienced it in some way, shape, or form. And so our supply chain folks are working day and night trying to make sure that we are smoothing that chaos out for our manufacturing facilities. And that's one of the big challenges at the moment. But looking forward, we actually do see a pretty solid recovery. We just kind of have to make it through the rest of this year.
Indeed, I think the message is very clear, and I do want to thank you, Jennifer, for speaking at this keynote session. I believe the call to action, wherein you have asked everyone to act now, take the advantage of the opportunity now, is pretty clear, and I hope our audience enjoyed that as well. Thank you so much for joining me here. This is Parvati Pillai signing out from the third Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference. We have a networking session at 2:45, and you can connect with the attendees at the conference using the network page on our conference page as well. So thank you so much once again, Jennifer, and to our audience for joining me here. Thank you.
Thank you all.